The soul isn't what you think. But it's very real. The word soul doesn't belong to any one religion, philosophy, or culture. It has lived longer than any system of belief, whispered through languages that no longer exist, drawn in symbols older than alphabets. It has been sung, prayed to, doubted, dissected, and dismissed. And yet, despite centuries of science, psychology, and secular thought, the soul still lingers. Not just as a concept, but as a feeling, a quiet certainty, felt most often in the spaces we cannot explain. We don't talk about it much anymore, at least not in academic terms. The soul has been relegated to poetry, to metaphor, to late-night conversations when life feels too heavy to carry alone. In a world obsessed with what can be measured, scanned, and defined, the soul doesn't fit. It's too vague, too mystical, too soft, and yet it refuses to disappear. Because no matter how far we advance, no matter how precisely we can map the brain, or simulate consciousness, or predict behavior, there remains a part of us that feels untouched. A part that still aches when nothing is physically wrong. A part that still stirs at a song, a story, a moment of unexplainable grace. That part is what we've always called the soul. Not because it's proven, but because no other word has ever quite captured what it feels like to be fully, deeply, and undeniably human. This isn't about religion. It isn't about heaven or hell, sin or salvation. This is about the soul as something more subtle, more psychological, more primal. The soul as the inner compass you can't articulate, but always feel. The soul as the memory of who you were before the world taught you how to behave. The soul as the voice that goes quiet when you betray yourself, and rises when you act in alignment with something deeper than logic. Because somewhere inside you, beneath the layers of conditioning, trauma, ego, and performance, there is a knowing. A sense that you were not simply born to consume, to work, to survive. You were born to witness beauty, to create meaning, to love in a way that leaves something behind. You were born to carry something sacred, even if you don't have the words for it. And when you lose that thread, when the soul goes quiet, the symptoms are strangely familiar. Numbness, restlessness, the haunting feeling that your life doesn't quite belong to you anymore. You wake up, go through the motions, play the role, but something is missing. Something essential, something invisible. That something is what this story is about. Not to prove that the soul exists in a scientific sense, but to show why, even in the age of logic, the soul is still the best word we have. For the part of us that dreams, that sacrifices, that forgives. For the part that breaks and rebuilds. For the part that feels older than the body it's housed in. The soul may not be what we think it is, but it's not imaginary. It is deeply, unmistakably real. Because every time you've stared at the night sky and felt small but safe, every time you've lost someone and felt them still near, every time you've created something beautiful for no reason other than love, you've touched it. Maybe not with your hands, but with the part of you that watches from beneath the noise. The part that survives failure, heartbreak, aging, and even death. That's the soul. Not a thing, a truth, not a possession, a presence. In the chapters to come, we'll explore where this idea of soul came from, how it's evolved, and why it keeps showing up in every culture, even as the religions that once guarded it begin to fade. We'll look at what science can't explain, what psychology quietly affirms, and what you've always felt, even if you've never said it aloud. We'll ask if the soul is just a story, or if it is the storyteller inside us. Because the soul isn't a fact to be proven, it's a feeling that refuses to die. And maybe that's enough. The soul has existed far longer than any doctrine that claimed to define it. It's a word that has traveled across thousands of years and dozens of languages, Yet its meaning has always been just out of reach. Not because we don't understand it, but because we feel it too deeply to reduce it to a definition. It's never been a concept to be pinned down. It's been a presence, felt in silence, invoked in ceremony, protected in myth. And that's what makes it timeless. In ancient Egypt, they believed the soul was not a single thing, but a collection of parts. The Ka, the Ba, the Akh, each representing different aspects of the self. Life force, personality, divine essence. When a person died, their soul didn't vanish. It split, journeyed, transformed. In Hindu philosophy, the soul is Atman, the inner essence, the eternal self, untouched by the body or mind. It doesn't die, it merely changes form. In Greek thought, psyche, the word we now associate with psychology, was once the soul, imagined as a butterfly leaving the mouth at the moment of death. Every culture has had its own word, nephesh in Hebrew, anima in Latin, ruach, chi, prana. In indigenous traditions, the soul is the breath of nature, the unseen thread that connects all living things. It moves through trees, animals, ancestors. It's not individual, it's relational. It exists because we are in relationship to each other, to the earth, to the unseen world. What's remarkable is not just that these cultures believed in the soul, but that they did so without ever meeting one another. Long before globalization, long before texts and translations, people from every corner of the earth arrived at the same intuitive truth, that there is something inside us that is not the body, not the mind, and not the personality. Something deeper, more enduring, more real. But as the world grew more complex, so did our ideas about the soul. Organized religion took hold, and with it came ownership. Now the soul was something that could be judged, saved, lost, or damned. It became transactional, a passport for heaven, a test of morality. The church told you how to care for it, how to confess, how to protect it from sin. The soul was no longer your own. It belonged to the divine hierarchy. And yet, even within religious tradition, the soul retained a kind of mystery. Theologians debated what it was made of, where it came from, whether it entered the body at birth or sometime after. Was it created by God anew for every person? Or was it part of a larger collective spirit, recycled through time? The fact that these questions remained unanswered, even by the most devout, speaks to the depth of the soul's ambiguity. It could not be boxed in. It could only be approached with reverence. Then came the Enlightenment, the age of reason, of logic, of science. And with it, the soul began to fade from credibility. If it could not be seen, weighed, or measured, it was dismissed as superstition. The body was now a machine. The mind, a complex algorithm of neurons and chemicals. Consciousness, once sacred, was reduced to a byproduct of brain activity. The soul, once the center of existence, was now an afterthought. Poetic, but irrelevant. But something strange happened. Even as belief in the traditional soul declined, the language never disappeared. We still say someone has a beautiful soul. We still talk about feeling empty or soulless, or connected on a soul level. Music moves the soul. Love touches the soul. Art speaks to the soul. These aren't just metaphors. They are confessions that despite our rational exterior, we still experience something deeper than intellect. Why? Because no amount of scientific progress has ever explained why we cry when no one's watching, why we feel homesick for people we've never met, why some moments feel eternal, even though they last only seconds. These are not physical events, they are soul events, and we still feel them, just as our ancestors did. Today we live in a fragmented spiritual landscape. Many people have left religion behind but still believe in something. Not a god maybe, but a force, a presence, a truth. They meditate, they manifest, They seek meaning beyond the material, and often the only word big enough to hold all that longing is soul. Not because it's proven, but because it still fits. So the word endures, not out of stubbornness, but necessity. Because we still need a way to speak about the part of us that dreams, that aches, that yearns for something more. Because the soul, as a word, is not just a relic of the past. It's a bridge, a thread, a reminder that for all our progress, for all our brilliance, we are still, at our core, searching for ourselves in the mystery of being alive. We live in an age that worships measurement. If it can be tracked, scanned, weighed, or photographed, it's considered real. If it can't, it's dismissed as fantasy, metaphor, or worse, delusion. And yet, some of the most important parts of human life refuse to submit to this standard. We can measure brain activity, but we can't locate consciousness. We can study behavior, but we can't define self. We can image the nervous system, but we still don't understand awareness. These aren't flaws in our tools. They're reminders that not everything essential can be seen. Some truths must be felt. The soul lives in that space. In the space science hasn't figured out how to reach. And despite centuries of progress in biology, neuroscience, and psychology, there are questions we keep circling back to. What happens at the moment of death? Why do some people report vivid near-death experiences, full of light, presence, peace, even when their brains show no activity? What explains the eerie accuracy of some past life memories in children who've never left their village? Why do we cry at music with no lyrics, or feel a spiritual shift while watching a sunset alone? These experiences don't fit neatly into research papers. They're messy, personal, emotional, but they're also universal. Which begs the question, if so many people across time and culture report the same kinds of moments, is it really delusion? Or is there something else happening that we simply don't have language for? In neuroscience, this conundrum is known as the hard problem of consciousness. It refers to the fact that we can explain how the brain processes stimuli, how neurons fire, how information is transmitted. But we still can't explain why it feels like anything. Why does sadness feel heavy? Why does awe make your chest tighten? Why do we have an inner world at all? A machine can react, a computer can calculate, but only humans experience. That gap between reaction and experience, that unmeasurable depth, is where many believe the soul lives. And then there's morality. We've developed elaborate systems to understand ethics, game theory, evolutionary psychology, social contracts. But the fact remains. From a very young age, humans feel that some things are just wrong, even when there's no consequence, even when no one's watching. Where does that come from? Not all morality is taught. Some of it is felt, hardwired, like a compass we didn't install ourselves. And when people betray that compass, when they lie, cheat, hurt others, it's not just the brain that suffers. It's the self. The part that can't be scanned or numbed. The part that knows. This is why, when someone has done deep harm to themselves or others, we often say they've lost their soul. We don't mean it literally. We mean they've disconnected from something essential, something human, something sacred. And no amount of therapy, pills, or punishment seems to fix it. Not until that deeper part of them is confronted. Not until they face who they are beneath the roles, the trauma, the defenses. In this way, the soul is not an object. It's not floating inside you, glowing and ethereal. It's more like a lens, a field, a frequency. It's the part of you that knows you're alive, not just biologically, but emotionally. It's the part that feels meaning, even when there's no reason for it. The part that breaks when beauty overwhelms, or when love leaves, or when your purpose slips through your hands. And yet, for all its depth, science often avoids the word soul. Not because it disproves it, but because it has no way to test it. It's easier to call these moments anomalies, outliers, emotional noise. But ignoring something doesn't make it vanish. You can't peer review grief. You can't replicate transcendence in a lab. You can study its effects: lowered cortisol, changed brain waves, activated empathy. But the feeling remains mysterious. It always has. Even the placebo effect, one of the most widely accepted medical phenomena, points to this mystery. People can heal, actually heal, because they believe they're healing. Faith, trust, hope. These aren't just emotional crutches. They alter chemistry. They affect cells. The body responds to belief in ways we still don't fully understand. And what is belief, if not the language of the soul? The discomfort here is understandable. If we admit there are things science can't fully explain, we risk opening the door to superstition, manipulation, false prophets. But there's a difference between rejecting bad ideas and rejecting mystery altogether. The goal isn't it to prove the soul with evidence. It is to recognize that some parts of being human are not problems to be solved. They are experiences to be honored. And perhaps this is why the soul has endured. Not because we can find it, but because we can't. Because even when every other system fails, the soul remains the last place we turn. When logic can't comfort, when words fall short, when grief is too large or love too sudden, in those moments, we reach for something that science doesn't offer, but the soul does. Meaning, not answers, meaning. And that is what keeps it real. If the soul is not a glowing orb inside your chest, and if it can't be found in brain scans or dissected under a microscope, then where does it live? For modern psychology, especially depth psychology, the answer is clear. It lives in the stories we carry, in the symbols we dream of, in the wounds we avoid, and in the truths that persist even when no one else believes them. The soul is not a thing we possess. It's a way of being, a felt sense of inner coherence, even when the outer world feels chaotic. Carl Jung, one of the great pioneers of modern psychology, didn't just believe in the soul. He saw it as the cornerstone of psychological development. For Jung, the soul was not a metaphor. It was the inner center of gravity. The self, not the ego that navigates the world, but the deeper, wiser, mythic core of who we are. He wrote about the soul as a guide, often appearing in dreams as a wise old man or woman, a child, an animal, a force, something we ignore at our peril. Because when we stray too far from the soul, life becomes hollow. We achieve, we succeed, we perform, but we don't feel real. This feeling, the sense of being disconnected from yourself, is something almost everyone experiences at some point. And when it happens, no amount of productivity, distraction, or applause can fill the void. You may look like yourself, sound like yourself, even fool others. But inside, something's gone missing. You no longer feel at home in your own life. That, in psychological terms, is a soul loss. And while it's not a term you'll find in most clinical manuals, it describes a reality millions quietly live with every day. In trauma work, this shows up in subtle ways. People who have survived deep emotional wounds often describe feeling numb, fragmented, or haunted by a part of themselves they can't name. They say things like, "I don't feel like myself," or "It's like something inside me shut off." These are not exaggerations. They are echoes of something sacred that was forced into silence. The soul, in these moments, doesn't disappear. It retreats. It hides behind the defenses we built to survive. And until we're safe enough to face what hurt us, the soul remains buried, alive but unreachable. Therapy, at its best, is not about fixing problems. It's about creating space for the soul to return, not with fanfare, not with fireworks, but slowly, like warmth returning to a frostbitten hand. It's about telling the truth, allowing grief, naming the parts of ourselves we were taught to suppress. It's about remembering who we were before we were broken. Because the soul never asks you to become someone else. It asks you to come back to who you already are. Even in neuroscience, where discussions of the soul are often avoided, there's growing recognition of something deeper than cognition. Practices like mindfulness, breathwork, and somatic therapy are being embraced not just because they help regulate stress, but because they reconnect people to something wordless inside. A sense of presence, of clarity, of wholeness. These aren't side effects, they're signs that the soul is stirring. And then there are the moments of inexplicable knowing. The times you meet someone and feel like you've known them forever. The dreams that feel more real than waking life. The decisions you make not with logic, but with that deep yes that rises from somewhere below your thoughts. These are not random, they are the language of the soul. And when we listen, even briefly, we find that life begins to feel aligned again. Not perfect, not painless, but real. Jung also spoke of the shadow, the parts of the soul we deny or disown. These are the aspects of ourselves we've exiled. The rage, the desire, the need for love we were told was weak. But the soul cannot be edited. It doesn't split itself into good and bad. It wants integration, not perfection. And the longer we avoid our shadow, the more we feel haunted, not by ghosts, but by the unlived parts of our own life. To reclaim the soul, then, is not to become spiritual in the traditional sense. It is to become honest, to stop outsourcing your value to the world around you, to stop performing a version of yourself that earns approval but costs you your peace. The soul does not thrive on praise. It thrives on truth. And the truth is, most of us are more tired than we admit, more hurt than we show, more hungry for meaning than our modern world can provide. But we don't need to go back to ancient temples or mystical traditions to find the soul. We only need to pause, to listen, to speak what has been unspeakable. The soul doesn't ask for your belief, it asks for your attention. And when you finally give it, not as a theory, but as a lived experience, something shifts. You begin to remember, not facts, but yourself. And when that happens, the soul is no longer just a poetic idea. It becomes your compass, your anchor, your fire. We often assume that to speak of the soul is to speak of religion, that anything sacred must belong to a system, a temple, a scripture, a doctrine. But the sacred predates all of that. It existed long before names like God were uttered, before rituals were formalized, before belief was measured in membership. The sacred was never meant to be exclusive. It was never owned. It is not found in rules, but in recognition. The sudden, overwhelming feeling that something meaningful is happening, even if you can't explain why. This is why so many people today, even those who left religion behind, still speak in spiritual terms. They talk about energy, about connection, about the universe sending signs. They practice mindfulness, breath work, journaling. They light candles, not because they were told to, but because something about the flicker feels like home. And while these things don't always fit into traditional definitions of religion, they are undeniably sacred. They are acts of remembering, of coming back to something deeper. Because what most people are missing isn't theology. It's presence. It's awe, it's stillness. It's a language for what stirs the heart when logic runs out of breath. And in that sense, the soul remains as necessary as ever, not as a theological object, but as an emotional compass. It's the part of us that knows when something matters, that knows when to stay, when to walk away, when something is real, and when something is just noise. We've built a world that runs on noise, productivity, algorithms, spectacle. We are constantly pulled outward, rarely invited inward. But the soul doesn't shout. It doesn't trend. It doesn't sell. It waits, patiently, painfully, for you to stop long enough to hear it. And when you do, you remember what no amount of religious training or secular achievement could teach you. That you are not just a brain, not just a body. You are here, alive, aware, and capable of meaning. Art is one of the last places where the sacred still breathes freely. Music that moves you to tears. A painting that feels like it was made from your own memories. A film that stirs something in you that's never had words. These moments are not just entertainment, they are reminders. The soul speaks in symbols, in beauty, in resonance. And when we experience art that cuts through the surface, we are not just inspired, we are remembered. The soul recognizes itself, so too in grief. When someone dies, even the most rational minds find themselves speaking of spirit, presence, essence. We light candles. We speak to them in our heads. We feel them near. These are not delusions. They are attempts to express something the mind can hold alone. That love does not vanish with breath. That something of the person remains, not in heaven perhaps, but in us. The soul, it seems, is not afraid of death, only of being forgotten. In a similar way, love often becomes a spiritual experience, not because it follows a formula, but because it defies one. To love fully is to open yourself to the unknown, to risk, to surrender, to be changed. And when that happens, we feel something sacred rise inside us. Not just emotion, but expansion. We become more than we were, more honest, more exposed, more alive. This, too, is soul. Even in moments of crisis, when everything falls apart, when beliefs crumble and certainty slips through your hands, the soul remains. It doesn't offer solutions, it doesn't promise rescue, but it offers presence. A quiet place to land. A voice that says, "You are still here, you are not lost, you are still real." That voice may not sound like anything you've learned, but you'll recognize it. You always do. And maybe that's why the soul endures, even when religion fades. Because it was never tied to rules, it was tied to recognition. The way you feel when you see a stranger cry and you understand. The way your heart stirs at the edge of the ocean. The way silence sometimes feels like a conversation. These are not religious experiences. They are human ones, and they are sacred. Not because someone told you they are, but because something inside you insists they are. So no, you don't need to believe in the soul in a theological sense. You don't need to subscribe to a religion, or pray a certain way, or believe in an afterlife. You only need to admit that something inside you longs for meaning, for truth, for a life that doesn't just function, but feels. And when you admit that, you're not weak, you're not naive. You're remembering the part of you that has been waiting all along. The soul doesn't need a religion, it needs a place to live. And more than anything, it needs to be listened to. You don't have to believe in the soul to know that something inside you breaks when you betray yourself. That something rises when you do the right thing, even when no one is watching. That something aches when you're not living the life that feels like yours. We all know this. We just rarely name it. And when we do, the only word that ever seems to fit is soul. It's not about religion. It's not about proof. It's not about ancient metaphysics or modern neuroscience. It's about the experience of being alive in a way that logic can't contain. It's about the stillness that finds you in grief, the electricity that moves through you in love, the quiet pull toward beauty that no one taught you to feel. These are not just emotions, they're echoes, reminders that you are not just functioning. You are existing. You are witnessing your own life from within. There is a part of you that watches when everything else shuts down. The part that keeps feeling even when you want to go numb. The part that remembers who you were before the world told you who to be. That's what we've always tried to name. That's what cultures across time and language have tried to honor. Not as a scientific reality, but as a felt truth. And yes, it's imprecise, it's unprovable. It can't be dissected or diagrammed, but it shows up when you're quiet enough, when you stop pretending, when you stop performing. And for a moment, you hear your own life speaking back to you, not in words, but in recognition. That recognition is what people have called sacred. It's what they've built rituals around, painted onto cave walls, sung into the night. It's what has kept humanity from giving in to despair, even when the world offered no reason for hope. It's what tells you that even if you've lost your way, even if you've abandoned yourself, it's not too late. There's still something inside you that remembers. There's still time to return. The soul isn't an answer. It's a question that refuses to leave. It's the part of you that keeps searching, not because it's broken, but because it knows something more is possible. A more honest life, a more loving one, a life that doesn't just look right from the outside, but feels right from within. The part of you that keeps searching. So maybe it doesn't matter whether the soul can be proven. Maybe what matters is that we live as though we have one, and treat others as though they do too. Because when we do, something changes. Not just in our beliefs, but in our behavior. We listen more. We speak more gently. We dare to live by something deeper than survival. And that, in the end, might be the soul's greatest truth. Not that it makes us superior or special, but that it reminds us we are responsible for our choices, for our presence, for the way we carry ourselves through a world we can't always control. It reminds us that even in a universe that may be vast and indifferent, we still have the power to make something sacred, not by what we believe, but by how we live. And if you've ever felt that power, even once, then you already know the soul may not be what you thought it was, but it's been with you all along.